So, at the start of this video, I'm just going to mention that this is an overview video that I'm submitting mainly to keep this in the time limit allowed by the Design Studio rubric. There are specific video entries into my development diary, each of which on its own would already fill up the time for the different game jams, a bit of a look at the semesters in review, so having a look a bit at the overarching themes for the game jams for that semester, looking into Design Studio and the other modules. And there's also a specific video on the World's Vegas Brief assessment or assignment from Design Studio. However, that is where a lot of the detail lies. This is mainly meant to be a video that shows, okay, these are the overarching themes from the year as far as this submission is concerned, and sort of exploring the overarching themes from those videos. Starting then to look at that overview from the game development side. And again, I'm going to start at the higher level and we'll drill down a bit to a couple points in a moment. So the general theme from Game Jams 1 through 4 is, okay, in Game Jams 1 and 2, as much as I'm a designer nominally at that point, I'm not really doing that much design work. Because of the teams, I'm mainly doing coding at that point, but I'm still able to sort of find my feet and do something at least that gets some element of the design in there, or solidifying some elements of design before going out and just making a thing. There's a very steep shift to Game Jam 3, where by that point I'm actually starting to get to play the role mostly as a designer in the team, rather than necessarily having to cover all the time. And it's the point where I start saying, okay, let's get some paper prototypes done of levels, let's start actually getting an engine and dealing with what's being made and putting it together to form a world. And then by semester 2, we're getting to a situation where Global Game Jam, I'm pretty much exclusively working as a designer, apart from some project management stuff that I mentioned in the video. And then Game Jam 4, it's full steam ahead on designing, documenting, and building. So, looking then first to sort of that exact experience that I've just mentioned. Game Jam 1, most of what I was spending my time on is coding. It's a previous skill set I've had, so, I mean, admittedly, it was Python, but for this point, it's building something in C++, but as I mentioned in Game Jam 1, it isn't Unreal compatible, which is the big issue. I thought I was working to an Unreal compatible system because I just knew that it took C++. Of course, given the 2-week deadline, I had decided not to research it and just crack on with the work instead. Now, a lot of the game logic here was essentially just, okay, we need game logic because it's a 2-person team. I've got an artist as my other team member. Let's get something done that we can try and hook it together. Now, ultimately, as I say in the Game Jam 1 specific video, that doesn't happen at the end when we start merging the work, but most of my time spent here just to try and get something that can work for the game logic, ultimately playing into my strengths from previous existing knowledge and also sort of starting to develop that understanding of the systems design perspective. By Game Jam 3, I'm doing a bit of art instead of coding, just to cover in that role. Again, most started to get into design, but a lot of the art stuff also helps in terms of, okay, admittedly it's lower level, it's something I'm not as good at, but getting this perspective also understands, okay, here's how I'm making a character, for example, at the top here, or these are the different kinds of elements that make up a level, and, okay, I as a designer have said I want these in the level, let's try and make those two assets. And at least from this experience, I'm starting to understand, okay, I'm saying I want something that looks bouncy, how do I do that? Okay, these mushrooms, not immediately obvious from the asset themselves, but how they contrast with the background, and understanding those kinds of requirements, and then being able to apply that in future for when I'm asking artists whether it's possible to make these kinds of assets to create certain effects later on, for example, in the Project Bruin, which is what you're seeing here is the documentation contents page for the final Game Jam, the Game Jam 4. Now, admittedly, a lot of that, because of how long it is, I'm not going to be able to get into. There's a full, I think it was hour recording at least, probably cut down a bit for the final upload, or in my Game Jam 4 specific video, but when we're getting some experience, or at least when I'm getting some experience from having to code all the logic, and having to make assets and distinguishing foreground from background, and understanding, okay, how do I get that world building element? It's all bringing it forward into the later stage when we get to actually building a fully fledged design and sort of having to hand that off to others and getting that understanding of what they need information wise to be able to do their job. Looking then at the sort of more design specific elements, Game Jam 1, as I mentioned, had some element of me working as a designer, namely a 30-minute meeting at the start of that studio time immediately after we got the brief, saying, okay, what are we making? Let's get some notes down, and even getting a tiny bit of concept art done, namely outlining the world in which we're taking it. Now, of course, this was partially because I wanted to make sure that both me and my teammate were essentially singing from the same hymn sheet with what we were trying to make. But it's also interesting because as a designer, having this record and just getting that idea down seemed to be slightly weird within the context of what every other group was doing and actually spending some time doing it. But I guess that is the instinct as a designer of know what you're making before you go make it, and that's when this kind of stuff comes into play. And it is a habit that continued throughout the rest of the projects of, actually this works. It helps everyone understand what the overarching thing they're doing is anyway. By Game Jam 3, as I mentioned, I'm starting to paper prototype the levels, and partially this is because I finally have the time, but also because when you're dealing with, for example, a platformer where you're no longer randomly generating things, you need to be able to know what's going where, and you have to have a rough idea what you're making so that it is a situation where, okay, I can ask the coders to make a bounce pad or a ladder or a pillar which you can't go through to divide the level. And this was sort of where, at least in my work for game development, that started where I'm paper prototyping for myself first of all, so I can know what I need to go and ask for, what the requirements are going to be, and also how things are going to interact. Then of course, there's also the fact that by Game Jam 3 I'm starting to work in engine, and actually, okay, I'm actually starting to go from paper prototype to actual engine build, because ultimately there's going to be changes that need to be made. For example, they aren't visible in these three, but it is visible in some of the images I have in the Game Jam 3 specific video of, okay, you'll notice in one of them that there's two of the background images at different heights. This is mainly so that the background image is always visible and fits within the world structure in terms of how high up you are supposed to be. And then, of course, there's the fact of, as a designer, I want to go in and make sure that everything works, and if changes need to be made, it's something which I understand the intention and can go back. Of course, from this module, or this implementation, it is a relatively simple version because everything's predefined. There's only 9 levels, and it is something where it's a platformer. You're not going in and building an entire world. But taking that and being able to understand, okay, yeah, this is actually sort of how long it takes as well, that's useful, particularly going forward by the time that we get to the global game jam, or the global game jam, where, okay, because it's a short time frame, you're having to get assets in pretty quickly so that you have enough time to, for example, scale it, as I had done in the actual thing. And you can see some example tests where I've done that, where it's like, okay, I need the bubbles to be different sizes visually, so that you can tell how many lives you have left, whilst also I need to know, okay, do those bubbles look like they're going to fit within the arena? Or are they too big? Are they too small that you can't see them? And are they good enough that you can distinguish some of the sizes against opponents? In the end, these are the kinds of tests that I was running, and I think it worked quite well in the end, in terms of, by the time that we got to shipping the game, the bubbles, for example, seemed the right size and are clearly distinguishable. And then you also have, for example, the composition of the rhythm stage in the Global Game Jam, again mentioned in the Global Game Jam video. It is very much about making sure that there's an aesthetic and a world that is built, because what we're getting from the artist is individual assets of, for example, the rings, the bubble, the soaps, and making sure that that fits nicely and that you have a screen. And that was again my responsibility, to just go and build that to make sure that it all works together. Admittedly, it wasn't the most complex, but definitely helped when it came to stuff later on, for example in Game Jam 4 when I had to go build a UI. Then there's other elements of game development, for example source control. Going from a situation in Game Jam 2, as I explained there, where I've nearly crashed a GitHub. Well, actually I did crash a GitHub in Game Jam 2, but that was mostly because the git ignore was badly set up, and learning, okay, make sure your source control is absolutely certain, because if you can't roll it back and retrieve your data, that's when you're screwed, and you have to spend an hour or 2, or 4, I think it was in the end, trying to salvage what you can. Then again, there's other simple versions, such as using a Google Drive, as we did for Team 12 in Game Jam 3. It was simple in this case, it was effective. I mean, in the case of Game Jam 3, as I explained there, we as a team knew that only one person would ever be working on the live build at any given time. So it's a situation where I, as the designer, was saying, okay, I'm not going to really touch this until I've been told and being given the all clear by the coders that what we have is sorted, and I'm reporting back any issues. And it ended up working, because it was very much a workflow which allowed that to happen. And then, of course, when you get into the more complex stuff, like the Global Game Jam or Game Jam 4, again in its own video, where you need all that complexity and you're going to have multiple people working on the live build at once, going back to GitHub and understanding that and making sure it is set up correctly, as I made sure there, so that we have less risk of losing it all. Also, as a designer, it's the idea of, okay, what am I handing over as concept art? You can see early on in Game Jam 2, I have very basic concept art there. Admittedly, this is again a symptom of I'm sitting down with the team for an hour just to make sure that everyone's on the same page before we go off and start working on the game. And there isn't really much time for a designer to be a designer. To the Global Game Jam, where I'm already concepting out different icons for the shop. To Game Jam 4, when over in the far side, you'll notice that I'm concepting out all the structures that we're asking for, saying, okay, alongside descriptions, this is the visual, this is what I'm thinking, this is how I'm interpreting it. Here's a visual aid to help you develop your version. And a lot of this, again, is to help the artists. And whereas in Game Jam 2, it is very much a situation of, okay, here's the idea. Understanding, particularly grown from that Game Jam 3 situation to the situation where I need to be able to communicate to artists, okay, I want this with this effect as a designer because I need it to fit in this situation. Okay. Understanding then, easiest way to do that is concept art, provide that with the explanation, and that is where that comes in. Of course, another side, particularly on the systems end, is numbers. Going from a situation where I'm scribbling out numbers in a notepad, even in the Global Game Jam, to let's actually get tables out, let's actually say this is what we're dealing with at certain levels, or this is the algorithm I'm going to be using to calculate price. This is very much a situation where I've taken it on board for particularly Game Jam 4 just to actually get the system right. And this is very much a systematic decision because, okay, if you're going to be doing a resource collection sim, or at least in part, you want that to have expandability and you're not going to want to hardcode everything. So again, this is why I insisted on the algorithms and being able to apply those in a way which allowed theoretically infinite expansion of the game. Of course, there's also the hand-ins, where we've gone from a situation where, as a designer and team member, we had as Team 1 some zipped files from C++ showing the code I'd made to actually getting a team-based executable runnable file for Game Jam 3 to an actually nice to play game for the Global Game Jam, this is the kind of progression where sort of the team working skills that I mention in a lot of the videos come in, where, okay, we're dealing with situations where we're just dealing with what we have, to finishing a game and finding that motivation to actually keeping pace and ensuring that teamwork. I mention a lot more about this in the individual videos, and you'll see the progression over time if you watch all of them, but it's a bit of a longer subject that I don't think I can fit into the time in this video. However, I'm also going to mention a couple things about Design Studio. So, for example, starting with the pictures, I have a separate video for the World's Vegas Brief and some of the feedback I got from there. However, we have a look at the progress, particularly compared with the icebreaker that we did at the start of the year, where no one's really confident. It's very story-based at that point, to a situation where in the World's Vegas Brief, we're starting to talk about level mechanics, we got concept art, we're diving into the lore of the world, to even the financial data, even though that definitely needed work. It's that contrast there that shows, yes, there's progress, and it is very much that shift from what is game to the specifics of that game, and very much dealing with the design of a game rather than the concept of a game. And then quick mention on the theory and the application from semester 2, for example, the design tests, mostly applied in the context of, for example, Game Jam 4, but also the specific tasks of, for example, creating a D&D class. I mean, the D&D class was interesting because of how expansive the existing homebrew network already is, and trying to find something unique, mostly through working certain combinations together. But the actual theory, the application, such as the ethics, the documentation, mostly shown in Game Jam 4, and something that I'm going to have to leave for a lot of the existing video based on time. And a final mention to the development diary. Probably could have done this better in terms of time management, because I had a couple where I did a series at roughly the halfway mark, and I've now done a series now. Pushed it a bit late given the situation with Game Jam 4 and wanting to get as much of that in as I can, so pushing the deadline on this. However, hopefully still good enough. However, that is roughly where my time is, so I do have to leave the video there. As I say, I go into a lot more depth in the existing dev diary entries. This is mainly the overview, and for that purpose, it does the whistle-stop tour. And to that extent, that's the first year of my development as a designer, and it's on to year 2.